that you've never been able to explain. Could be nothing. Could be everything. Either way, I want to hear it. Now, let's begin. Story 1. Della Foss had been carrying a pack for 11 days when she stopped on the trail above Roan High Knob and noticed the fire. She was 43, a middle school science teacher from Knoxville on a solo section hike, something she'd been planning since before her divorce was finalized. She had one of those lightweight titanium cook pots that she'd agonized over for weeks, a purple sleeping bag liner she'd ordered twice because the first one came in the wrong size, and a blister on her left heel that she'd named Gerald, because naming it made her feel better about it. She was, by her own assessment, a competent hiker. Not fast, not young anymore, but competent. The fire was small, just an orange smudge somewhere below the ridgeline in the trees to her east, flickering through the spruce fir, maybe 300 yards off trail. She stopped and looked at it. The time was somewhere around 8:30, maybe 9. The sky was that deep, bruised purple that happens in the last 10 minutes, before full dark up on the balds. She could smell the smoke faintly. She thought nothing of it. Other hikers used dispersed camping. People built fires. This was normal. She ate her dinner, ramen with some powdered butter she'd been slowly using up, sitting on a rock with her legs dangling off the trail edge while the wind came across the grass in long, slow waves. The fire below her was still there, steady, not growing. She set up her tent in a flat section just off the trail marker, brushed her teeth with filtered water from her Sawyer squeeze, and got into her sleeping bag with a paperback she'd been carrying since Damascus and hadn't really read. She read 4 pages and fell asleep with the book on her chest. She woke up because the fire was closer. She didn't understand that at first. She just woke up and felt wrong, and lay in the dark for a moment, cataloging the feeling. Cold air at the tent seam, normal. Wind against the fly, normal. The smell of smoke stronger than before. She sat up. Through the mesh panel of the tent, she could see the light. It was maybe 60 yards away now. Still small, still steady, but definitely closer than the distant smudge she'd seen from the trail. The forest between her and it was dark enough that she couldn't see anything except the fire itself, and the pale underside of the nearest trees lit orange. She unzipped her sleeping bag, got her headlamp on, then sat very still and just watched. The fire was not moving. Whatever was moving around it. She could not have explained how she knew this. It was the shadows, the way they shifted at the edge of the light. Not in the stuttering random way that flames cause, but in a rhythm that suggested something, walking a circle, slow and unhurried. She counted. She was not sure why she counted. The shadows shifted on a roughly 15-second interval. Whatever was making them was big enough to interrupt the light at that distance. She kept her headlamp off. She sat with her knees pulled up to her chest and did not move. The rational part of her brain was sorting through explanations. Another hiker. A bear circling a campfire someone had abandoned. The way mountain air and slope and tree line could bend light and create optical effects she didn't understand. There were good explanations. The rational part of her brain kept hitting a snag, which was that fires don't move uphill by themselves. Because over the next 40 minutes, it did. Not fast, not in jumps. It just slowly, steadily came up the slope toward the trail. The shadows moved around it the whole time, circling that same slow, patient circle. She did not turn her headlamp on. She did not make a sound. At some point, she realized she'd been holding a breath for too long and let it out very carefully through her nose. When the fire was perhaps 30 yards from the edge of the trail, it stopped. She sat in the dark for what felt like an hour, but was probably 20 minutes, watching the light not move. At some point it went out, just gone, between one moment and the next. like a candle being pinched. The darkness after it was total and absolute and louder somehow than before. She did not sleep again that night. In the morning, she packed fast, not rushing, or telling herself she wasn't rushing, and hiked 3 miles north before she stopped to eat anything. The trail above Roan High Knob was empty. Beautiful, actually, the grass pale gold in the early light, the mountains layered blue and gray and blue behind each other to the horizon. She stopped at the bald and looked back south toward where her tent had been. There was no smoke, no char, no sign of any fire from any angle she could see. She spent a long time looking. Then she adjusted her straps and kept walking. She didn't tell anyone about it for 2 weeks. And when she finally did, she told it the way she was telling it now, flatly and in order, because that was the only way she could make it feel real. Her sister asked if she was sure she hadn't been dreaming. Della said she'd been sure of very little in her life, but she was sure of that. Gerald the blister healed up around Irwin, Tennessee. She finished her section and drove home and graded papers and bought a new titanium pot on sale and signed up for another section next spring. She is going back. She just hasn't decided yet which direction to start from. Story 2. The deer was standing in the creek. Not at the edge of it, not drinking from it. In it, knee-deep in moving water, in the middle of Laurel Fork Creek, just north of the Dennis Cove trailhead, in the Roan Highlands, standing absolutely still and staring directly at Brecken Maurer, with both eyes at the same time. Brecken was 26. He'd been working seasonal for 3 years, mostly fire crew and trail maintenance, was currently on a personal trip, just hiking for the sake of hiking, which he didn't do enough of, considering it was technically his profession. He had a can of Copenhagen in his back left pocket and a water filter clipped to the outside of his pack, and he'd been on trail since 6 that morning. It was now maybe 2 in the afternoon. The creek crossing was shallow enough to step stone across, and he'd been about to do exactly that when he saw the deer. He stopped. The deer did not move. He looked at it. The deer looked at him. This was normal so far. Deer did this. They froze and watched you, and then one of 2 things happened. They bolted or they decided you were boring and went back to what they were doing. He waited for one of those things to happen. Neither one did. He watched for probably 2 full minutes, which is a long time when you're counting it in your head, and the only sound is the creek moving over rocks. The deer did not blink, or he didn't see it blink, which might not be the same thing. It was a doe. No antlers, no spots, so fully adult. Healthy-looking coat, no ribs showing, nothing obviously wrong with it, except that it was standing in moving water up to its knees and looking at him with an expression he could not stop trying to read, which he knew was stupid. Deer didn't have expressions, but his brain kept insisting there was something in the face he needed to understand. He took 1 step forward to cross. The deer made a sound. He stopped. He had heard a lot of deer sounds. The snort, the bleat, the alarm bark, that sharp single bark that scared the hell out of you if you weren't expecting it. This was none of those. It came from the deer's throat, but it was low and sustained, almost a moan. And it had a quality that he kept reaching for a word to describe and kept not finding one. The closest he got was wrong. The sound was wrong in the way that a recording played at the wrong speed is wrong. Technically, all the component parts are there, but the whole thing lands incorrectly. The deer made the sound again, longer this time. Brecken took a step back. This was not a conscious decision. His legs did it before he decided anything. The deer turned its head 90 degrees to the right and stood like that, looking at nothing for about 4 seconds. Then it turned its head back and looked at him again. Then it opened its mouth. He needed a second to process what he was seeing because mouths on deer are small and soft, and this one was open too wide. The jaw dropped further than the structure of the face should have allowed, and from inside that open mouth came the same low, sustained moan, longer this time, much longer, and under it there was something else, A layered harmonic, like a chord played on an instrument he'd never heard. He left the trail. He didn't plan to, and he didn't think it through. He just turned sideways off the path and walked quickly through the brush, paralleling the creek for about 100 yards until he found a different crossing and got to the other side and kept going. He did not look back for a long time. When he finally did, he could not see the crossing he'd been at. The creek curved there, and the trees were dense. He sat on a rock and ate half a granola bar, and did not think about the deer at all, which took significant effort. When he got back to his truck at the trailhead and drove to the nearest gas station, he bought a Gatorade and sat in the parking lot for 15 minutes before he drove home. He told his crew chief about it the next week, because the crew chief had been doing backcountry work for 30 years and had heard most things. The crew chief listened without interrupting. Then he asked what color the eyes were. Brecken had not thought about the eyes. He said he didn't know. Brown, probably deer eyes. The crew chief nodded slowly and said he'd probably just seen a sick deer, maybe CWD, chronic wasting disease, could cause strange behavior in the late stages. The jaw thing could be a symptom. The sound, maybe stress vocalization. Brecken said maybe. The crew chief changed the subject, and they talked about a blowdown on the Overmountain Trail that needed clearing. That was 3 months ago. The thing Brecken keeps coming back to when he lets himself think about it is not the sound, not the jaw, and not the 2 minutes of motionless staring. It's the eyes. Because he did remember the color of the eyes. He'd been looking at them for 2 full minutes, and he remembered. They were the wrong color, not brown, not the dark liquid brown of a deer's eye. Something else. Something he keeps trying to name, and keeps landing on the same inadequate word. Wrong. Story 3. Reina Castellano was not supposed to be on that part of the trail. She was 31, a night shift ER nurse from Asheville, on her first solo hike since before nursing school, ate her 20s whole. She'd taken 4 days off, driven to the Nantahala National Forest, and picked a loop she'd found in a guidebook that was rated moderate and promised a ridgeline view she'd been thinking about for approximately 2 years. She was comfortable in the woods. She was not comfortable being alone in them, which was exactly why she was doing it. She made a wrong turn somewhere above Wesser Creek. She knew it as soon as she made it, that nagging friction of terrain that doesn't match what you've been told to expect. And she stood on the trail for a while, second-guessing herself, before she pulled out the topo and confirmed that, yes, she was going slightly wrong. She corrected. It cost her about 40 minutes and left her making camp later than she'd planned, in a depression between 2 low ridges where the trees were tight and the ground was damp and flat enough to sleep on. She was eating dinner, tortillas with peanut butter, when she heard the crying. It was a woman's voice, far enough away that she couldn't make out words if there were words, but close enough to hear clearly in the way that sound carries in still mountain air at night. She put her food down and listened. The crying had that specific quality of something that has been going on for a while, raw and exhausted rather than sharp and sudden. It rose and fell. She stood up. The rational calculation was this: there was a distressed person in the woods, possibly injured, possibly lost, and she was a nurse with a headlamp and a first aid kit and a satellite communicator. She called out, "Hello?" and her voice felt very small going into the trees. The crying stopped. She stood and waited, headlamp aimed into the dark. Nothing. Then she called again and said that her name was Reina and that she was a nurse and that if someone needed help, she was right here. The crying started again, closer. She stood very still and listened. It was approaching from her left, through the trees upslope, moving toward her camp. She could not hear footsteps, just the crying, which is something she would think about later, because a person moving through underbrush in the dark makes noise, feet on leaves and sticks and ground. But all she could hear was the voice getting closer. She called out again. Nothing changed. The crying kept coming. When it was maybe 30 yards away, she turned her headlamp off. She did this without thinking, and she's not been able to fully explain why. Some reflex, some old animal thing under the nursing training and the rational brain that said, "Do not let it see you." She crouched behind a downed log and held very still and pressed her back against the bark and watched the dark. Whatever was making the sound passed within 15 feet of her. She knows this because at its closest point, she could hear the texture of it, the breath beneath the crying, the way the inhale came. She could not see it. The tree cover was total. No moon that night. She had her hand on the satellite communicator in her hip pocket, and she did not press the button. She was not sure why. She sat in the dark and did not move and waited. The crying moved past her and downslope, continuing south along the depression. It got quieter as it moved away. At some point she realized it had stopped, and she didn't know exactly when, which meant she didn't know how long she'd been sitting against that log in the dark. She slept in her tent that night with the zipper held shut with a carabiner. In the morning, there were no tracks in the soft earth around her camp that she could attribute to a person. There was a long depression in the leaf litter 30 yards from her tent that could have been anything, a deer trail, a drainage line, nothing. She hiked out the next morning a full day early and drove back to Asheville with the heat on even though it wasn't cold. She went back to work 2 days later. She has done 2 more solo trips since then, and she takes them both seriously and carefully. And she tells herself what she heard was a fox, because foxes in distress sound almost exactly like a crying woman. She knew this. She'd heard it before. She tells herself that almost every time she thinks about it. The fox explanation. She keeps it close. She just can't make herself believe the part about the footsteps. Hey, I want to take a second here, because that story deserves a breath. If you've been here a while, you know that the accounts that get to me aren't the dramatic ones. They're the quiet ones. The ones where someone smart and capable is backed against a log in the dark, holding a communicator they can't make themselves press. That's the one. If you're new to the channel, welcome, and please consider joining the membership. Members get early access to full episodes before they drop publicly. Plus, there are exclusive stories in the members-only feed that never make it to the main channel. The link is right there in the description. Okay, Story 4. Story 4. Owen Brecht had been doing photography for maybe 8 years before the incident at Black Rock Summit, and he would be the first to tell you that most of what he shot was mediocre. He was 48, worked in IT support for a university outside Harrisonburg, Virginia, and photography was the thing he did on weekends to feel like himself. Mostly landscapes. He drove to Shenandoah maybe a dozen times a year and hiked to various points along the Appalachian Trail, where it cut through the park, set up his tripod, and tried to catch light doing something it only did for 30 seconds in any given day. He was at Black Rock Summit just after 4 in the morning on a Saturday in mid-October, because the forecast had suggested clear sky and a possible fog layer in the valley below, and he wanted to catch that with the pre-dawn blue. He'd driven up the night before, slept in his car in the Black Rock parking area, set an alarm, and hiked the half-mile to the summit in the dark with his headlamp in his bag. The summit was rocks, big stacked quartzite boulders that formed a rough open area with a 360-degree view, the valley to the east, the mountains south and west, the sky above enormous and full of stars because the air was dry and cold, 41 degrees, and he'd brought a thermos and a fleece liner that he was glad he hadn't left in the car. He set up his tripod and started shooting, long exposures in the dark, watching the eastern sky for the first gray. He had his phone in airplane mode to save battery and his thermos between his feet, and he was genuinely happy, which was not always something he could say at 4 in the morning. He was checking an exposure when he noticed the figure. It was standing at the southern edge of the rock field, maybe 40 feet from him, just standing, arms at its sides. He could see the silhouette against the slightly lighter sky. He had not heard anyone approach, but the wind was coming from the north, so that was possible. He called over, "Hey there," just to be sociable, because he thought it was another photographer or an early hiker. It didn't respond. He looked at his exposure result, looked back up, still standing there. He said hello a little louder this time. Still nothing. The figure was not moving at all, just standing at the edge of the rocks with the valley behind it, arms straight at its sides, and he could not make out anything about it except the shape, which was human enough in outline to be a person and wrong enough in its proportions for him to keep looking. The arms were too long. He almost talked himself out of this. Optical illusions were abundant in low light, foreshortening, the way darkness ate the joints and left only vertical lines. But the more he looked, the more convinced he became that the arms of the figure at the southern edge of Black Rock Summit extended past where arms should end, the hands somewhere near the knee level, maybe lower. The whole silhouette stretched in a way that did not quite map onto a person, even if that person were extremely tall. He turned his headlamp on and aimed it. The figure was gone. Not gone as in it had walked away. Not gone as in he'd been looking in the wrong direction. Gone as in the rock field where it had been standing was empty, and he could see the whole edge of the summit from where he was standing, and there was nothing there. He sat very still for a moment. Then he took his camera off the tripod, picked up the tripod, and walked back to the parking area without looking behind him, which took considerable effort. He drove to a diner outside Luray that opened at 5 and drank 2 cups of coffee and ate eggs he barely tasted while the sun came up through the window. He went back to Black Rock 3 weeks later, in daylight, with a friend. He told the friend he wanted to shoot the fall color from the summit, and that was true. He stood at the southern edge of the rock field and looked at the drop and the valley and the long view, and felt nothing unusual and was glad. He still goes to Shenandoah. He still shoots at pre-dawn. He just doesn't go to Black Rock alone anymore, and he's not entirely sure why he feels like that's the right call. Because what he saw was almost certainly nothing. He can list the explanations: rock shadow, another hiker who left quickly, a trick of low-light perception on an eye that had been staring at a screen for an hour. Almost certainly nothing. He's mentioned it once to his daughter, who looked it up on her phone immediately and found several accounts from Black Rock Summit of similar figures seen at night, long-limbed, still, present, and then not present. He told her to put her phone away. She did. They ate dinner, and he felt the whole conversation try to pull itself somewhere he didn't want to go, and he redirected it with a story about a hawk he'd photographed in the valley, and she let him. He hasn't looked up any of the accounts she found. He's made a deliberate decision about that. Story 5. The voice that called Prentice Good's name was his brother's. He was certain enough of this that he turned around. He was on a ridge above Grayson Highlands State Park in Virginia, mid-November, solo, which he did 2 or 3 times a year, and he was not the sort of person to be startled by his own name. He was 51. He'd retired from the Army a few years back, done 2 tours that he didn't talk about, and taken up solo hiking the way other people took up golf, methodically and with significant financial investment in the equipment. His brother's name was Rafe, short for Raphael, and they hadn't spoken in about 11 months, due to a disagreement about their mother's estate that had gotten ugly in the way that those things do, and the sound of Rafe's voice coming from the tree line, maybe 30 feet behind him, was specific and clear, and contained exactly the cadence that Rafe used when he was trying to get the Prentice's attention. The slightly drawn first syllable, the drop on the second. Prentice. Patient and a little exasperated. Prentice stood on the ridge trail and looked into the trees and said, "Rafe." The trees said Prentice back. Same voice, same cadence. He stood for a moment. The ponies that Grayson Highlands is known for had all moved to the lower meadows by November, so there were none around, and the ridge was empty of other hikers as far as he could see in both directions. The sky was gray and low, that particular November gray that settles like a lid, and the grass of the bald was pale and bent north. He'd been hiking since 8 that morning. It was now maybe 1 in the afternoon. He said Rafe again, into the tree line. The tree line said his name again. He had been in enough situations to know the feeling in his body that meant something was wrong, and that feeling was present now, located specifically in the base of his throat and both shoulders. He did not go into the trees. He stood and waited. The voice said his name 3 more times, spaced evenly apart like a signal, like something testing whether the interval was working. He stood and said nothing and listened, and did not move. After the 3rd call, it stopped. Absolute silence in the tree line, and then the normal sounds came back. Wind and the creak of branches, and somewhere, a woodpecker doing its rapid work on a dead pine. He hiked out. He didn't stop, didn't camp. He covered the remaining miles to the parking area in good time, and drove to Abingdon and ate dinner at a diner, and sat at the counter, and told himself what he'd heard was a bird, because there are birds that mimic, gray catbirds and mockingbirds, and occasionally starlings, and sound in mountain terrain carries in strange ways, and the valley acoustic effects could plausibly reshape a natural sound into something that resembled a familiar voice. He called his brother from the diner parking lot. First time in 11 months? Rafe picked up on the 2nd ring and sounded surprised, then cautious, and they talked for 22 minutes, about nothing in particular, the estate thing left carefully to the side. And when Prentice hung up, he sat in the cold car for a while and thought about what exactly had made him do that. He went back to Grayson Highlands in the spring. The ponies were out. He saw 5 foals. He hiked the same ridge. He stopped at the same spot where the trees had called his name and stood for a full minute looking into the timber. The pines were full and green and impenetrably dark past the first 20 feet. Something was moving in there. He stood and watched the moving shadows and waited. The movement resolved eventually into a pair of deer, a doe and a yearling, passing through. He watched them until they were gone, and then he kept hiking. He and Rafe talk most Sundays now. Neither of them mentions what split them up. Prentice has never mentioned the voice on the ridge to his brother. He doesn't plan to. Story 6. Tamsin Voke had done the 100-mile wilderness in Maine twice before, and both times she'd done it the right way, which in her estimation meant slowly and with attention. She was 38, had quit a marketing job the year before to do a full-through hike, and had made it from Springer to Cotadine in just under 5 months, which was not record time but was hers. She kept a handwritten journal, not a blog, a composition notebook she'd bought at a dollar store in Damascus, Virginia, and had carried the whole way. She was in the 100 miles, 6 days out from Monson, when she found the campsite. She hadn't been looking for it. The shelter listed for that section of trail was another 4 miles north, too far to make before dark, and she'd been scanning for flat ground when she saw the fire ring, neat and recently used, with a good flat space around it and a bear hang already rigged between 2 birches. Someone's camp, she figured, or a frequently used dispersed site. She was glad for the fire ring and the flat space, and she set up and ate and got her bear hang up alongside the existing cord. The journal entry from that night is the one she reads back and still can't fully account for. She'd written for maybe 20 minutes by headlamp, and then closed the notebook and lay in her sleeping bag listening to the forest. She wrote that the sounds were wrong. She couldn't get a more specific in the journal, and she can't now. The insects were there. The wind was there. But underneath it, at a level that was almost below hearing, there was a vibration she felt more in her chest than her ears, low and steady, like a machine far away. But there were no machines out there. She was 30 miles from the nearest road. She lay for a long time and listened to it, and at some point fell asleep. She woke up to voices, specifically She woke up to the sound of people talking in the camp, calm, conversational, two voices at least. She lay in her tent for a moment, thinking another hiker had come in and was setting up. This was normal. Shelters were shared. She reached for her headlamp and then stopped. The voices were speaking at the same time, not talking over each other the way people interrupted each other or spoke quickly. They were speaking in unison, both voices, the same words, the same tempo. And she couldn't make out the words, which was the other thing, because they were close, 10 or 15 feet from her tent at most, but the words wouldn't resolve into meaning. They kept slipping just past intelligibility, the way a word will when you've heard it too many times in a row. She lay in the dark with her hand on her headlamp and did not turn it on. The voices continued for maybe 5 minutes. Then they stopped. Silence. The full kind, even the insects were quiet. And then the low vibration she'd felt before was gone too, and the insects came back slowly. First one, then another, and in another few minutes, the forest sounded normal again. In the morning, she saw the camp. The fire ring was cold. The bear hang cord she'd tied alongside the existing one was intact. She walked a circle around the site and looked at the ground, which was mossy and damp enough to hold impressions. She found her own boot prints clearly. She found some older partial impressions that she couldn't date. She found nothing recent. She hiked out to Applebridge and ate a burger and refilled her water and sat at a picnic table writing in her journal. The entry from that morning has a line she put a box around, which she does to mark things she can't work out. It says, "Either there were two people who left no tracks, or I dreamed it, but I was awake. I know I was awake." She finished the trail. She summited Katahdin in light rain on a Tuesday morning and cried a little, which she was not embarrassed by. She's already planning a second through hike in 2 years, Maine to Georgia, the other direction. She'll pass through the 100-mile wilderness again. She doesn't know if she'll camp in that same spot. She thinks she probably will. She's not sure why. Story 7. There's a section of trail in southwestern Pennsylvania, just north of the Maryland border, where the AT threads through a strip of mixed hardwoods above a creek called Tom's Run. And in late August, that creek is low and clear, and you can see the bottom for 10 feet in any direction. Ferris Calloway was fishing it on a Thursday afternoon, not on the AT, but parallel to it, working upstream from a Forest Service road where he'd parked his truck. He was 63. He'd been guiding bear and deer hunters in the area for 22 years, and he fished Tom's Run 2 or 3 times a summer. Always alone, always midweek when the trail traffic was light. He knew that section of forest, the way you know a room you've lived in for years. He knew where the bedrock made the water pool into a good hole. He knew which fallen oak had created a sheltered seam on the north bank, where trout held in the current. He knew the light and the sound of that specific creek in that specific month. He was not the sort of man who got turned around or rattled. He was working the good hole with a streamer pattern when he saw the man standing on the far bank, or the shape of a man. In the shade under the big hemlocks on the far side, there was a form, vertical, upright still. He squinted. The light under hemlocks in late August is complicated. There are shafts and shadows that do unusual things to shapes, and he wasn't sure enough of what he was seeing to say more than a shape. He called over, just a holler the way fishermen do. Nothing. Shape didn't move. He kept his eyes on it and worked his fly back toward him slowly. Sometimes deer stood in shade like that and fooled you from a distance, the upright branches behind them suggesting a human outline. He'd been fooled by that before. This was probably that. He cast again. When he looked back, the shape was gone. He stood in the current for a moment, looking at the hemlock bank, the shadows layered under those long, draping branches. Nothing there. He waited a few steps downstream to get a different angle. Nothing. He went back to fishing. 20 minutes later, upstream on his side of the creek, something moved through the brush on the bank. He heard it before he saw it, and it was large, heavy, the sound of significant weight on dry leaves, and he turned to look. The brush was dense there, mountain laurel and young birch, and whatever was in it was moving parallel to the creek going south, which was the direction he'd come from. He could see the laurel shaking. He could hear the pace of it, and the pace was bipedal. He would say that under any circumstance, he knew what a bear sounded like in brush, and what a deer sounded like, and what a person sounded like. And this was the last one. 2 beats, a brief pause, 2 beats, the rhythm of walking. He watched the brush and waited for whoever it was to come out onto the creek bank, and the brush shook south for another 20 seconds and then stopped. He waited. Nothing came out. He waded to his bank and looked at where the movement had been. 25 feet of mountain laurel, right up to the creek edge. Nowhere for a person to go without coming out into the open on either the creek side or the trail side, and he could see both. He stood on the bank for a while with his rod in his hand and looked at the laurel and listened. Wind in the hemlocks, water, one bird far off. He packed up and walked back to his truck at a reasonable pace, not hurrying or telling himself that. And when he got there, he sat on the tailgate and drank a warm Coke he'd left in the cab and looked at the Forest Service road going back into the trees. He's been guiding in those woods for 22 years. He went back to Tom's Run the following August. Same week, same spot, same streamer. Nothing unusual. He tells the story occasionally to hunters who want to hear it, and he tells it the same way each time, matter-of-factly, like a fishing report. He ends it the same way every time, too. He says, "I've been in those woods a long time, and I know what I saw and what I heard, and I've got no explanation for it that satisfies me." And then he changes the subject. If you've made it this far, first of all, good, you've got a strong constitution. Second of all, have you hit that like button yet? Go ahead and do that right now. It takes 2 seconds, and it genuinely helps this channel more than you might think. It tells the algorithm that real people are watching and not just bots, and it helps me keep making these. 7 stories in, 6 more to go. Let's keep going. Story 8. It was the smell that Nadia Osei-Mensah noticed first. Not the sound and not the shape, just the smell. And even before she was fully awake, she knew something was outside her tent, and she knew it was not a deer. She was 29 and had been doing seasonal trail maintenance work for the Appalachian Trail Conservancy for 2 summers. She was camped at a shelter on the Maryland section of the trail, near the Annapolis Rock area alone, on a Sunday night in early June. She knew that section well. She'd worked it for 3 weeks and camped in and near that shelter several times. She was comfortable there. She was asleep and then she was awake, and the smell was the reason. Animal was the first thing. Musky and thick and with a warmth to it that suggested something nearby and large. The way a horse smells when you're standing next to one. That heat and hide and breath combination. She lay still and listened. No sound she could identify. Wind in the leaves, the normal creak sound from below the ridge, the shelter's tin roof ticking as the night got cooler. She reached for her headlamp and held it without turning it on. The smell was still there, strong enough that she could identify it as coming from outside the tent, from uphill, which was the direction of the shelter's back wall. Something was between her tent and the back of the shelter, in the narrow corridor of packed earth and dead leaves. She could not hear it, but she could smell it, and the smell was intensifying slowly, which meant whatever was producing it was getting closer to her tent, or was breathing heavier, or both. She lay with the headlamp in her hand and did not move. Her sleeping bag was good down to 20 degrees, and she was fully inside it. The tent was a double-walled 3-season, and she was aware of how little protection it actually represented against anything with intent. The smell peaked and held for what felt like several minutes. Underneath it, she noticed something she'd missed initially, a sound so low it was nearly below sound. A vibration, really, like a large engine far away. Except there were no roads close enough for that. The vibration had a rhythm to it. It was not mechanical. It was organic. She would think about this later and use that word deliberately, organic. because it breathed the way living things breathe. Then the smell started to fade. It went slowly, taking maybe 10 minutes to recede from the air inside the tent to a faint background trace, and then nothing. The vibrations stopped a few minutes after that. She lay in her sleeping bag for another 2 hours before she fell back asleep. In the morning, she went around the shelter and looked at the ground. The earth was packed hard there, no good for impressions. She found some animal scat along the shelter wall. Black bear, she was pretty sure. The seeds and berry residue were right for early June. She told herself that explained the smell. She knows bear smell. She smelled it on other work sites. This was not quite the same, but she holds on to the bear explanation when she needs something to hold on to, because the alternative, the thing she sometimes lets herself consider at 2 in the morning when she can't sleep, does not have a name she can find in any field guide or any rational conversation she's ever had with anyone. She's doing a 3rd summer of trail maintenance. She put in for a different section. Tory 9. The map said there was nothing at Bear Wallow Gap. Jessamine Pryor knew this because she'd looked at the map before she started, and again at the trailhead, and a 3rd time when she was about a mile from the gap in the Great Smoky Mountains. The map said gap, an elevation change, and a faint blue line indicating seasonal water. It did not say structure. She was 44, a carpenter by trade, home renovation work mostly, out of Waynesville, North Carolina. She'd been hiking since she could walk. She did a 10-day solo in the Smokies every couple of years. Planned and careful, no ego about it. She turned around when she needed to and camped early when the weather looked uncertain. She had good instincts, and she knew how to read terrain. She was not the sort of person who saw things. The structure at Bear Wallow Gap was low to the ground, almost like a foundation rather than a standing building, made of stacked flat stones with gaps between them where the mortar had gone or had never been. It formed a rough rectangle, maybe 12 by 15 feet, open to the sky, covered in moss and the beginning stages of young birch growing in the corners. Old. She'd seen old structures in the backcountry before, summer grazing shelters, the remnants of homesteads that predated the park. This was plausible, even if the map didn't show it. She stopped at the edge of it and looked in. The interior was just ground, leaves and soil, a flat, mossy center. Some stones had fallen inward. An old fire scar, very old, blackened and faded, in the southeast corner. She stepped inside the foundation, stepping over the low wall, to look at the corner fire scar more closely. Something about the way the stones were arranged around it suggested it had been deliberate, not a wildfire, but a contained one. She was crouching over the fire scar when she heard the breathing. She did not move. She stayed crouched over the stones with her hand on one of them, and she listened, and it was breathing, slow and deep and very close, from outside the foundation on the uphill side. She looked at the ground inside the wall, and her shadow crossed it, and the breathing stopped. Silence. Her own heartbeat, surprisingly slow considering. Wind. She stood and turned and looked at the uphill wall of the foundation and saw nothing, just the stacked stones and the moss and the trees behind them. She stepped over the wall and looked behind it. The slope went up, mixed hardwood going dense quickly, nothing visible. She walked a slow circuit around the outside of the foundation. Solid ground, damp, pine needles and leaf mat. She got back to where she started and stood and looked at the structure. The breathing started again, from inside the foundation this time, from the corner where she'd been crouching. She was standing 8 feet away, with a clear sight line to that corner, and nothing was in it. She stepped back twice, watching. The breathing continued, slow even, the pace of something at rest, something with lungs significantly larger than hers. She counted 4 breaths. On the 5th, she stopped counting and turned and walked north, and did not stop walking for 2 miles. She made camp that night on a high ridge with long sightlines in every direction, and a fire she kept larger than she needed it. She ate her dinner and wrote in her notepad, not a journal, just a small spiral thing she used for measurements at work, and what she wrote was the time and the GPS coordinates she'd marked when she'd stopped, and 2 words: not alone. She looked up Bear Wallow Gap when she got home. There are references to it: elevation, trail condition notes, nothing about structures. She reached out to the park's backcountry office about the stone foundation, and they said they'd have someone check it out. She doesn't know if anyone did. She didn't follow up. There are calls she can make without being sure she wants to hear the answer. Story 10. The night Corey Elam saw it was the night he was supposed to be in Gatlinburg, celebrating his 35th birthday. He was in Gatlinburg. He'd driven up from Chattanooga with his girlfriend and her 2 friends, and the plan had been dinner and drinks and whatever came after that. But he'd needed air, or he'd needed not to be in a loud restaurant, or he'd needed something he couldn't name. And around 9:30 he'd told them he'd be right back, and walked out of the restaurant, and just kept walking until the town got thin and then gone. And the trail started, and he was on the Appalachian Trail, heading north in the dark with his phone flashlight because he had no headlamp. This was, by his own assessment, not a smart decision. He had good shoes on because he'd worn his hiking boots out of habit, and he'd left his jacket on the chair in the restaurant, which was a problem. The night was clear but cold for October in the Smokies, and the trail climbed fast above the town, and in 10 minutes the lights of Gatlinburg were just a glow below him, and he was alone in the dark. He wasn't scared. He was 35 and felt 40, and he just wanted to breathe mountain air for a while and look at stars and stop being at the table with people he loved who kept asking if he was okay. He was somewhere on the Sugarland Mountain Trail, he thinks, maybe a mile above the trailhead, when his phone dropped below 10% and the flashlight got weaker. He stopped and looked at the screen and thought about turning back. Decided to go a little further first. He turned his flashlight off to look at the stars, and that's when he saw the figure on the slope above him. It was standing on the trail, uphill, maybe 40 yards. He could see it because there was enough starlight filtering through the bare upper branches to give shape to things, and the shape on the trail was wrong for a tree. It was upright and it was tall enough that his first thought was it was a hiker in a tall pack. Except there was no pack, and the proportions were off the way things are off when you're looking at something your brain doesn't have a ready template for. He stood on the trail and looked at it, and his phone died. The darkness after the screen went off was very complete. He stood still and waited for his eyes to adjust, and thought about moving very quietly backward down the trail. The starlight came back as his eyes found it, and the shape was still there. It had not moved. He could see it against the lighter gap of the trail above, the silhouette of it. It was facing him. He made himself think through what he was looking at. The height was the main problem. He's 6'1", and this was taller by a significant margin. The shoulders were broad and the head was either very large or had something on it. He couldn't tell which. The arms were close to the body. He watched for movement, and the figure stood completely still. He backed up 3 steps on the trail. The figure did not respond. He backed up 3 more. His heel caught a root, and he stumbled and caught himself and looked up, and the figure was still there. He turned and walked fast back the way he'd come. He didn't run, or he told himself he didn't run, but he was moving faster than walking, and his arms were going, and his breath was loud in his own ears. The trail went downhill, and the lights of Gatlinburg came back below him, and he kept moving until he was on pavement. And then he kept going until he was at the restaurant door. His girlfriend was outside looking for him. She looked at his face and asked what happened. He said nothing. I just walked too far. She looked at him for a long time, and he could see she didn't believe him, and he was grateful she let it go. He doesn't hike without a headlamp anymore. He carries a backup one. He does still hike, and he's done several sections of the AT since that night. He's a different hiker now, more methodical, more prepared, which his girlfriend says is an improvement. He agrees with her on that. What he saw on the Sugarland Mountain Trail at 9:30 on a cold October night, he doesn't have a word for, and he's stopped looking for one. The birthday dinner that night was pretty good. He can't remember what he ate. And now we've hit 10, and I want to take a second here. If you're watching this late, which I know most of you are, do me a favor and share this episode with one person who loves this kind of story. Not someone you want to scare, someone who already loves it, who gets it, who will thank you for sending it. That's the best kind of recommendation. 3 more stories. We're not done yet. Story 11. Holt Duvane's daughter had given him the hiking poles for his birthday, and he'd left them in the car twice before he actually started using them. And then on a section of trail in northern New Hampshire, he'd tripped over a root and cracked a knee on quartzite, and been very grateful for the poles during the mile back to the trailhead. He was 67, retired from 30 years as a rural mail carrier in Vermont. His wife had passed 2 years before. He hiked because it was something to do with his body that wasn't sitting in the house. He was on the Franconia Ridge Trail on a Tuesday in mid-September. Not peak foliage yet, but close. The maples showing their first urgency of red and orange. The ridge itself was exposed and windy, and the view in both directions was the kind that made the 3-hour drive from his house worth it. He ate his lunch at the Lafayette Summit marker, half a sandwich and some crackers, sitting on a flat rock with the wind tearing at his hat. He was coming back down the Falling Waters Trail, which he'd done before, maybe 4 times over the years, when he saw the man sitting off-trail in the trees. Just sitting. Cross-legged on the ground, back against a birch, facing away from the trail, looking downslope. Older-looking, gray-haired, in a jacket that was too thin for the September wind. Holt slowed down and looked at him and felt a familiar human obligation to check in, because a person sitting alone in the woods facing downhill looked like several different things, and most of them warranted checking. He called out, "You doing okay over there?" The man didn't respond, didn't turn around. Holt stopped on the trail and looked at him. The posture was upright, not slumped, not injured looking, just sitting. He called again, "Hey, are you all right?" and took 2 steps off the trail toward the man. The man turned around. Holt stopped. He spent a good amount of time since then trying to account for what he saw in those 2 or 3 seconds. And the most precise he can get is that the face was wrong in a way that resolved very quickly into something he could explain. Specifically, he thinks the angle of the light and the shadow of the birch had done something strange with the features. There was a moment where the face looked like no face he'd ever seen on a living person, pale and flat and without the specific geometry that faces have. And then the man smiled, and it resolved back into a face. He said he was fine, just resting his feet. His voice was normal. He had a day pack on the ground beside him, sensible hiking shoes, a water bottle clipped to the pack. Holt nodded and said, "Okay, just checking," and stepped back to the trail and continued down. He did not look back. He could not have told you why, the way he sometimes can't tell you why. He puts one hand on the steering wheel when he changes lanes even on empty roads. Just something in his training or his wiring that said, "Keep moving," and he followed it. The face in the moment before the smile. He sees it sometimes, in the pause before sleep. He tries to map it onto an explanation, shadow, angle, an unusual feature in an ordinary face, and the map almost works, almost. And then some small specific thing comes back to him that he can't account for, and he starts over. He called his daughter that evening from a diner in Lincoln. She asked how the hike was. He said good. The leaves were starting. She asked if he'd used the poles. He told her yes, every step. She sounded pleased. He ate his dinner and drove home in the dark with the radio on and did not think about the face in the trees. He has not entirely stopped thinking about the face in the trees. Story 12. The last miles into Springer Mountain in Georgia are supposed to be ceremonial. That's what every account Vera Masthead read said. The trail comes down off Amicalola Falls and joins the approach trail, and you walk those 8 miles with the knowledge that whatever comes next, you made it. Georgia to Maine. 2,100 miles, done. She was 46. She'd started in March, a retired art teacher from Columbus, Ohio. 3 kids now in college or past it. A husband who'd driven her to Amicalola in the rain and told her he'd be there when she got back. She'd walked for 5 months and 9 days. She'd lost 22 pounds. She'd made friends and lost them to faster paces or slower ones, and walked most of the last month alone, which she'd found she preferred. She was within 4 miles of the Springer terminus when the man started following her. She didn't notice him right away. She heard someone on the trail behind her, footsteps at a comfortable distance, and she'd moved aside twice to let people pass without being passed, which was odd but not alarming. A lot of people paced inconsistently. She hiked on. He was still behind her at 3 miles out. She stopped at a water source and filtered a liter and looked back down the trail while she waited. The man was standing on the trail about 60 yards behind her, watching her. He stopped when she stopped. He was wearing regular clothes, not hiking gear, jeans and a dark jacket, no pack, no poles. He was too far away for detail. She could not see his face clearly. She called back, "Hey." He did not respond. She drank her water and shouldered her pack and kept going. She hiked fast, faster than her normal pace, which after 5 months of trail, she could sustain for a while. And she hiked and listened, and the footsteps behind her kept pace, not gaining, not falling back. At 2 miles out, another northbound hiker came down the trail toward her, heading south, a young guy doing a day hike with a small pack. She stopped him and told him there was a man behind her on the trail who had been following her for 2 miles, and she was a woman alone, and would he walk with her for a bit? He said yes without hesitating. They turned south together and walked back toward where the man had been. The trail was empty. The young hiker walked south with her for 10 minutes, both of them looking, and there was nobody on the trail in either direction. She thanked him. He asked if she was sure she was okay. She said yes, and she was close enough to okay that yes was accurate. He headed south. She turned north. She summited Springer alone at 3:47 in the afternoon. She sat on the terminal plaque and ate the last of her gummy bears, which she'd been rationing for 400 miles for this purpose. She cried once, briefly, and felt embarrassed, even though there was no one there to see it. Her husband was in the parking lot at Amicalola when she came down 2 hours later. She got into the car and he asked if she was ready to go home, and she said yes. He started the car. She looked out the passenger window at the Georgia trees going dark in the evening and thought about the man on the trail, the way he'd stopped when she stopped, the way the trail had been empty when she went back. She's written about the whole hike, 40,000 words and counting, in a document that she intends to eventually print and bind for her kids. She has written the summit day in detail. She included the man on the trail, everything she could remember, because she decided the account wasn't honest without it. She doesn't know who he was. She does not have a theory that she feels confident about. She is glad she asked the day hiker for help, and she is glad the man was gone when they went back. She does not use the word glad lightly, and she would not trade the ending of that hike for a cleaner one, even if she could. But she'd be lying if she said she wasn't watching the trees when the car pulled out of the Amicalola parking lot and onto the road south. Story 13. There are things Gus Tillerman tells his grandkids about the Cherokee history of the Smoky Mountains, and things he doesn't tell them. He was 72. He'd grown up in Swain County, North Carolina, on the reservation, the Qualla Boundary, and he'd been in and out of those mountains his entire life, first with his grandfather and later with his own sons, and now occasionally with their children. He was not a superstitious man. He was also not a man who confused honesty with courage, meaning he'd learned to say, "I don't know," and leave it at that when "I don't know" was the accurate thing. He was on a section of trail above Forney Creek, the deep western drainage of the park, in a part of the Smokies that most tourists never reached, because the access was long and the terrain was unforgiving on an April morning that had started clear and gotten complicated. The weather in the Smokies in April was weather that made decisions for you if you weren't paying attention. And Gus had been paying attention for 72 years and still found himself in rain that turned the trail to chocolate and fog that closed the view to 15 feet. He was heading back down toward the trailhead when the fog opened briefly and he saw the man standing on the far side of Forney Creek. The creek was running high from 2 days of rain, dark and fast over the boulders, maybe 30 feet across. The man on the far side was standing at the edge where the bank dropped into the water. He was facing Gus. He had no rain gear, which in April in the Smokies in rain was wrong. He was barefoot, which was wronger. He was standing in the rain with his face turned toward Gus, and he was not moving. Gus stopped on the trail and looked at him. The man across the creek was dressed in what looked like old clothes. Old in a specific way. Not just worn, but of a different cut than people wore now, the collar and the shape of the jacket. Gus could not see the face well. The fog and the rain and the distance made detail difficult. But the posture was facing him, clearly, directly toward him. He watched for a moment and then called across the creek, asking if the man was all right. The man raised one hand, palm out, slow, just that. Not a wave, not a greeting, just the hand raised. Gus stood on the bank and looked at the raised hand and felt something he didn't have a ready word for in English. The word he had was in Cherokee, and it referred to a particular kind of recognition that didn't mean you knew the person, but meant you recognized that the person existed in a different way than most things existed. That they were here and present, but also somewhere else, and that you should not cross the water to where they were standing. He stood on his bank. The man stood on his bank. The rain came down between them. After a long moment, the fog came back in and the far bank was gone. Gus waited for a while. Then he continued down the trail to the trailhead. He drove to Cherokee and stopped at his sister's house and drank coffee at her kitchen table. She asked him how the trail was. He said wet. She asked if he saw anything. He told her about the man across the creek, what he was wearing, the raised hand. She listened. She asked if he crossed the creek. He said no. She nodded. Didn't ask anything else. They talked about his grandkids for a while, and then he drove home. He has thought about what he saw at Forney Creek many times since, and each time he arrives at the same place, which is that he saw something at the edge of a high creek in a rain, something standing still in weather no person would stand still in, wearing clothes that had no business being in that decade. And he did not cross the water to it, and the fog took it before he had to decide what to do next. And he is grateful for that. And he thinks the decision not to cross was the correct one. He has not been to that section of Forney Creek since. He goes other places. The mountains are enormous, and he knows a great many parts of them. He is in no hurry to go back to that one. His grandkids ask him sometimes what he saw out there over the years. He tells them some of it. He tells them the mountains keep their own records, and that some things they're not meant to read. They're young enough that this sounds like wisdom to them. He's old enough to know it's just honesty. And that's 13. 13 stories, 13 people, and every one of them walked out of the wilderness carrying something they hadn't gone in with. I've said it before, and I mean it. The accounts that stay with me are not the ones with the most dramatic creatures or the biggest scares. They're the ones where a person stands very still in the dark and makes a choice, and lives with what that choice means afterward. If this episode got to you, I would be genuinely grateful if you'd take a second to subscribe and share it. Not because of the numbers, though those do matter, but because these stories deserve to be heard, and there are people out there who've had their own version of every one of them, and who need to know they're not alone in that. Hit the subscribe button, pass this episode to someone, and leave a comment below with the one thing from tonight that you'll still be thinking about at 3 in the morning. I'll see you next time. Stay on the trail.